Could you briefly mention those 5 pillars that you mentioned again earlier?
The theme.
Yeah.
Yeah. So low in saturated fats and instead being rich in unsaturated fats, particularly polyunsaturated fats. High in fibre. A bias for plant protein over animal protein. And that's important because 75 to 80% of the average person in Western countries' protein intake right now is animal protein. We should probably flip that. And then low in ultra-processed foods, and 60% of the average person's calories in this country comes from ultra-processed foods. Speaking about divisiveness early on, I think one thing that we actually can all come together and agree on is that that's a huge portion of calories that we know are not really serving that person.
Yeah, and I would actually like to start there. Just at the outset, like there are many things that just collectively we're in agreement with. For example, these ultra-processed foods that find their way in many people's diet is just causing havoc within the system. And the quality of our food, no matter what you eat, is going to be an important pillar, right? And so like there's certain things that I think we can kind of lay the foundation of that are really important. What would you say a few of those would be before we dive into protein, which is where I would want to start after that?
Certainly trying to reduce ultra-processed foods in the diet is kind of the lowest hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And if you think about, a lot of people blame the dietary guidelines and say the dietary guidelines in 1980 are responsible for poor health today. One of the important principles I mentioned earlier when looking at different nutrition studies is, if you're reducing your exposure to something, what are you eating instead of? And so a lot of the guidelines through the 1980s and 90s have sort of promoted a lower saturated fat diet. They want people to eat less saturated fat, which is a good recommendation. The problem is what you replace it with. If you replace saturated fat with refined carbohydrates, you don't see a reduction in disease risk, and you may actually see an increase in disease risk. And this is why you might see some people out on social media saying, hey, look at this study, see saturated fat's not a problem, but not appreciating in that study what were people eating instead of. And so when we're reducing saturated fat from animal foods in our diet and instead eating all of this ultra-processed food that it does contain fats, but it also contains a lot of refined carbohydrates, we're not shifting these important biomarkers in a favorable direction. We're not reducing our risk of diseases. So certainly lowering our exposure to ultra-processed foods and sort of by virtue of that increasing minimally or unprocessed plant foods, which increases our fibre, is one of the sort of biggest levers that someone can pull for sure.
Right. And maybe later we can dive into the various, there's just a myriad of different easy and delicious supplementation, things you can just swap out that, for what you're eating right now. Maybe that's more processed that still tastes great, but is just going to be so much better for you because you are emitting what you used to eat, but then also you're introducing something that is actually more beneficial for your system. So, there's many different macro and micronutrients that I want to kind of explore into the makeup of what it makes, what it takes to create a holistic, plant-focused diet. A big one for people that, are interested in introducing more plants into their diet is protein. There is, I think culturally, especially in the West, there's been this big tie between meat and masculinity, that if you want to build muscle, you have to have animal protein. There's just so much conditioning around how much protein we need when it's really kind of different from what the data actually says. And there's also the whole talk of just, phytoestrogens, there's the talk of, soy protein and a lot of things that people maybe don't have as much clarity on. So I'd love for you to kind of clear the field here a little bit.
There's a lot in there.
I just opened up a lot. So.
Yeah, I think I might have had about 10 or 15 hours conversation on some of this stuff. But,
and we can do our best, to, obviously for those that are listening, to check out the Proof Podcast with Simon, to dive into any of these that you want to in deeper and deeper levels. But let's, hit the low hanging fruit, I think, first and foremost.
Yeah, I think firstly, usually this sort of conversation around protein centers around the quality of the protein and the quantity of the protein. differences between quality between animal and plant sources, generally focusing on the amino acid sort of makeup. So we can talk about that. And then we can talk about how much protein someone needs and what studies show us in terms of outcomes for things like strength and performance. There's a pervasive idea out there that plants are missing amino acids. You may have heard that. I know I heard that when I was 17, 18 and reading fitness magazines and just talking about nutrition in like football locker rooms and whatnot, which is where you pick up a lot of information. And now also social media. But firstly, I just want to make it really clear to everyone that all plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. All plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. An essential amino acid, what is that? It's a building block of protein that our body cannot make. So we have non-essential amino acids and essential amino acids. The non-essential amino acids our body can make. The 9 essentials you have to get through your diet. And your body uses these amino acids to create proteins in the body, things like collagen, for example. So all plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. What is true is that in certain plants, there is what's called a limiting amino acid. So if we take grains, for example, rice, if André was to get all of his calories, let's say you eat 2,500 calories in a day, all of your calories just from rice, then you would fall short on your lysine requirements, which is one of those essential amino acids. But if you were to add in just modest amount of dietary diversity in there, some fruits and vegetables and legumes into that, no problems at all. You will now get all of the lysine that you need, and anyone can simply see this for themselves by using an app like Chronometer, which is a free app. You can plug in your food over the course of the day, and it gives you a breakdown of the 9 essential amino acids. So the only time that this would become a problem for someone is if they're living in a sort of developing country and they have poor food security, poor food access, and they're living off 1 or 2 sort of foods. So that's important for people to understand and appreciate. The next sort of piece or question that people have is, well, what about the bioavailability? Can we absorb that protein? Can we utilize it? And for this, we really need to look at outcome studies. So if we take a group of people and we randomize them into an omnivorous diet that has plant and animal protein, and then a group that has just plant protein, and we measure things like muscle protein synthesis or hypertrophy, the increase in size of muscle, or strength, right? Outcomes that we care about. And here we see that despite there being some differences in bioavailability, they're not huge. They're probably only a few percent once you account for preparing food properly. They'd be much bigger if you went and ate a raw bean or rice that wasn't cooked, which I wouldn't recommend.
Yeah.
We might get into anti-nutrients at some point,
yeah.
and that's where that often comes up. But when you are preparing these plant foods as you would to consume them, and you're consuming enough total protein, that's the key here. Hitting an optimal amount of protein. When you are doing that, there's no significant difference in multiple trials that have now looked at this.
Which would be what for most people in terms of quantity?
If we're talking about athletes, then a threshold and targeting sort of north of 1.5 grams per kilogram. I'm not sure what that conversion is exactly to pounds. Yeah.
A lot.
I'll leave that to
by
you.
2.2.
I'll leave that to you.
Yeah.
We can put that in the show notes.
Yeah.
The average person's protein intake in this country is about 1.1 to 1.2. Now, they're not all athletes, and they're not people that are trying to squeeze out all of the last few sort of drips of water out of that towel. So it kind of does come back to what is your goal. But if your goal is I'm training, I'm physically active, I'm an athlete, I want to optimize for muscle protein synthesis, hypertrophy, strength, then at least 1.5, 1.6 grams per kilogram. And when you're hitting that, it doesn't matter if it's coming from plant or animal sources. And that's not debated or controversial anymore in the academic sort of world. People like Stuart Phillips, for example, Professor Stuart Phillips, who for years has done research that's paid by the dairy industry and has been a big proponent of animal protein. He's changed his view. And that's what a good scientist should do. And that's because there has been, in more recent years, over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, a bunch of these trials coming out showing that actually when the protein amount is at an optimal level, there's no significant difference. To kind of extend that conversation a little bit further, we also just need to remember, often we sort of hyper-focus on protein, but we need to really appreciate that if you're going to build muscle and strength, the number one most important thing is resistance training. It's the actual stimulus, right? And there's a beautiful paper that looked at what happens to muscle strength as you increase protein in 2 different contexts. One, where you're increasing protein, but these people are not doing any resistance training. So if we just take sedentary people and jack their protein up.
Right.
And then the other where you increase protein, but they're doing resistance training. So in that first group, if they're just sedentary, pretty much nothing happens to their strength. You can eat as much protein as you want and the stimulus isn't there. You have to remember that the body is adaptive and structure reflects function. If the stimulus isn't there, that protein's not going to be put to use. It doesn't just end up magically as muscle. And in the second context where they're looking at increasing protein with resistance training, you see huge increases in strength, even at 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilo, which is around where the average person is. You see a little bit more if you get up to 1.5, 1.6. So that context is really important, particularly when you look at how much resistance training the average person in America does. 70% of people are not getting anywhere close to the recommendations. So the biggest lever that anyone listening or the average person across the United States in Western countries can pull is actually not so much hyper-focusing on their protein or if it's animal or plant. It's doing the resistance training.
Yeah, makes sense. Everyone wants to get in shape. No one wants to lift no heavy-ass weights. Okay, so yeah, that's important. I love that you spoke to the bioavailability because I think it's really key. And is there anything else that you want to touch on for people that still have this idea that plant protein is just is inferior to animal protein?
Well, I think inferior can mean a number of things.
Yeah.
If we're talking about a developing country where there's not enough food variety, then sure, I think animal protein within that context could be superior. Because it's giving you a more complete sort of amino acid profile. You're less likely to have some of those shortcomings when you're under-consuming protein if it's coming from animal protein. Hands down, absolutely. But when I think about superior, so let's flip that and think about what's superior. I think about, I want to, for me personally, I want to build muscles, maintain strength because it's a really important predictor of longevity. It also allows you to do many of the sort of functional things that you aspire to do in life. And as I just stated there, you can absolutely achieve that with plant protein. I extend my definition of superior to my long-term health. What's the condition of my heart? What's my risk of cancer? What's my risk of type 2 diabetes? What's my risk of premature death? And we have huge meta-analyses looking at that. And they do what's called a substitution analysis. And when you look at that, you see very clearly swapping calories from animal protein for calories in plant protein reduces your risk of cardiovascular disease, these metabolic conditions, and even premature death. And then to go a step further, we can say, well, what's better for the health of the planet?
Right.
And, I think it's something like 83% of the land that we use to grow food is for growing animal protein, but it only gives us 18% of our calories. It's extremely inefficient. It uses up so much land. And, that the cost of that is deforestation, less carbon that we can sequester, more water being used, loss of biodiversity. these are all externalities, external costs of that industry. So for me, my definition of superior sort of encompasses all of that. And that's, when I think of a quality protein, those are the things that I'm thinking about.